Hi, and welcome to another podcast episode of the Village ZM.
During this month of October, we are talking history, Zambian history to be precise.
Solely focused on our people and what led to this common identity we share.
Being Zambian means more than just citizenship. Tuck your buds in.
Join us on this journey of self-discovery through in-depth analysis on anthropology and historical context.
One who Zambia, one who nation, one who Zambia, one who nation, one who Zambia, one who nation.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Bro, I can't take that countdown seriously because of
You want a story, bro? Okay, let me do it in the series. This one. Okay, let's go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's good, everybody? Welcome to the Village ZM podcast, and welcome to this week's episode of Zambia History Month. And this is week 4 since we started this project. And oh my God, I'm just so grateful to everyone who's listened, everyone who's pitched in with conversation. It's just been a very beautiful experience. So we are here today to conclude our conversation on political history, which has rather been a crash course. And if you knew absolutely nothing about Zambian politics and you listened to our episode last week, then you definitely know more than the next person who did not, maybe your neighbor, So I guess, you have something to talk about with your neighbor, your workmate, or your girlfriend. I don't know if you guys are into politics but yeah. So yeah, I'm here with Kabanga and Vincent again. How are you guys doing? Before we get into this, it's always important to check on our guests. How are you guys feeling after the conversation we had last time?
That was an amazing conversation that we had. I learned quite a bit myself. The history of Zambia and the political history specifically is quite interesting. How am I doing? I'm doing great. I feel good, feeling good. Yeah.
That's good. What about you, Vincent?
No, same here. Easy vibes. Just really keen, to be here, and found a lot of the points that were made, especially on the colonial era and the politics that happened, really interesting because that was all new information for me. So yeah, really cool and keen to continue learning.
Isn't it pretty interesting for you guys that you've never been on a podcast before, and now for 2 weeks straight people are gonna be listening to your voices?
Bucket list item ticked off. I've been on a podcast.
Don't kill me, man.
That's mad, bro.
Yeah. Let's get into it, guys. Okay, so today we are talking multi-party democracy. And this is just a continuation of where we left off in our previous episode. If you haven't heard it, you can check it out. Go to our podcast platforms and check it out. But basically, we started talking about colonial history, what led to us being colonized, and the events that followed after, up until independence. And then we also talked about what happened post-independence during the governmental period where we were being governed by, I don't like the word governed, we were being served. The party in service was United National Independence Party, also known as UNIP. So yeah, so Kabanga is going to give us quite a lengthy lecture, as I might call it, quite a lengthy lecture on what happened post us introducing multi-party democracy up until, well, let's just see how far he's gonna go and then I can pick it up from. So yeah, over to you, Kabanga.
Thank you, Malimba. Thank you for giving me this platform to speak to our people. This is quite amazing. So last week, Malimba and Vincent did a nice exposition on the colonial period and talked about UNIP's era. We ended speaking about the food riots that happened and the KK capitulating and forming that transitory constitution which allowed for an election to happen in 1991. So let's get into it. I'm no historian, so thank you for lending your ears to listen to me speak to you. I think we're going to have a great time speaking about this interesting stuff that happened in our country. So enter Frederick Titus Jacob Chiluba, a very big personality, a very charismatic man. He was expelled from school because of political activities, and he became a bus conductor. Later, he became a politician, and he worked as a city councillor and rose in the ranks in the trade union and became the leader of the trade union. So, he was quite a character. He's a very big part of this period. So, in 1991, MMD comes to power. There had initially been a liberation movement. They were not a political party. They were just pushing for multi-party democracy. That's why the name was even Movement for Multi-Party Democracy. So in 1991, they become a party and they just decide to unify their voices as one and stand in the election. They win that election by a huge, huge margin, by 80%, if I'm not mistaken. And there was very, very high goodwill by the people. I mean, everyone was ecstatic after this period of economic decline, especially for the ordinary person, where you could feel it even as far as your stomach, to the extent that you had to have these rights for food. Change was inevitable and hope was high. So MMD comes to power and they immediately start to reverse the policies that KK had implemented. So because of the public goodwill that they had, and they were popular with the people, they were also popular with the international community. Frederick Chiluba was very popular. So they were able to implement very sweeping programs. We can call it a shock therapy of sorts. They instituted a dual reform. So on one hand, you had political liberalization, and on the other, you had economic liberalization. So what happened there was privatization of companies. The economic policies focused on making tariff cuts. They removed agricultural and industrial subsidies. They removed exchange controls to allow the economy to be a more open economy on where inputs could come into the country as well as exports from outside the country, which we'll talk about the political consequences of that liberalization. But because you had political and economic liberalization, these policies were kind of reinforcing. Another thing to note is how FTJ was very, very intertwined with the church, and the government of the day was very intertwined with the church. At the time, it was said by a prominent pastor at the time, I can't remember who he is, but like when President Chiluba, finally got into the presidentship position, we were very happy. We felt it was a very God-ordained situation. So you have those sentiments of he was chosen by God or he was raised up by God. You know, he had a very humble background and he grew. It was almost like an underdog story, you know. So people saw it as a God-ordained situation. And that allowed Chiluba to talk to the people in such a way that they would follow sometimes very difficult policies in the hope that in the future they would see the benefits of those policies. One of those things was the introduction of the free market economy. And this kind of actually hurt the manufacturing sector. There was a manufacturing sector which had been developed by KK in his time in power. But when FTJ came, opened up trade, and the manufacturing sector wasn't able to compete with these cheaper imports. They also had more state enterprises. I already talked about the privatization, but you had the mining industries being privatized, state-owned enterprises being privatized. So there was that economic situation going on. What happened to the people? Lots of people lost their jobs, especially in the copper belt. There was a very high unemployment rate. About 100,000 previous mine workers moved out of the Copper Belt, came into Lusaka looking for employment opportunities and entered into the informal economy. So that's how even the informal economy started to develop, and you see a lot of this informal trade happen, like Salaula. All of those things started at that time because of that decline in the manufacturing sector. Now we could get very cheap imports. So informal market now became the place to try to make a living. He also did not take into consideration that foreign investment should equally benefit the ordinary person. And at the same time, in his tenure, especially in his early tenure, certain ideologies which he had preached before started to turn back on them. Before coming to power, he preached for the freedom of the press. But when he came into power, he started going back on these things which he had been speaking for. And all of those political liberalization which he had been pushing started to go back on them. There was a politicizing of the constitution. In 1996, in 1997, Malimba, maybe you would know, or Vincent, you know, but the constitution was amended, and it was amended to be used as a political tool to stop Kaunda from running for president again, because Kaunda had wanted to come into active politics.
It was officially declared a Christian nation in 1990 during the preamble, but that constitutional amendment is the same one which was targeted at Kenneth Kaunda. This was where they had this law that was put where if you want to run as president, both of your parents have to be Zambian. And how we know that this was targeted at Kaunda is because none of Kaunda's parents were actually Zambian. They were Malawian immigrants that came into Zambia. But this was very unfair, especially because at independence, you know, especially with our federation and all of that, at the end of the day, you couldn't really tell who was from where because we were one people at the end of the day.
That's
but
true.
One thing that was emphasized was that if you were found within the confines of the Northern Rhodesian border at the time of independence, you were considered Zambian. So it was a huge, it was very sad that actually happened. But yeah.
So before you move on that point, though it may not be I guess the political like a historical fact, but could that whole enactment been the reason why? Have you heard those stories where it's back in the day, if you're working for government, it was a big thing if you are Zambian, and if you were found that that you weren't Zambian, you could just be taken and then shipped, across the border back to your country. Let's say if you were from Malawi and they found out that this guy is not actually from Malawi. People would be my boss is from Malawi. They report you and then they end up taking your boss and then it's you get replaced. So there was a whole period in time where your identity as being Zambian was constantly being questioned, and it could actually lead to certain types of economic ramifications.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because this strategy later comes to bite Chilwa in the back, because later that he is from Congo, and now it's okay.
The irony.
So life comes at you fast at the end of the day. So but we've seen even now there is this pattern that has developed of where you have these targeted people, and you hear even just from a rumor that they're from certain countries. Immigration is all over them. We have a very our immigration department is actually the strictest immigration departments, in my opinion, in just how they operate. And over the years, so many people have been deported. And but the manner of these deportations, I think this should be a conversation that we should possibly have another day. But back to you, Kabanga.
Those are some very interesting insights that you didn't know any of that, actually. So thanks for that, guys. I digress. So at that time, Kaunda was actually deemed stateless. He didn't have a country. He wasn't Zambian. And this was deemed by the court actually, and that decision was reversed after an appeal. Thank God. Just imagine a person who fought for a lot of freedom for the country then becomes a citizen of nowhere, which is quite sad actually. So the government persecuted a lot of the previous government. So the MMD government persecuted a lot of the UNIP era government officials. And that was a theme of his presidency, at least his first term, to ensure that he could consolidate his power coming in the second term in 1996. So in his second term, this is where you have a lot of decline in the country, actually, economically and politically. Economically, we started to see a great increase in the debt that we had. Politically, we could start to see sentiments in the party, in the MMD, for trying to maybe put a third term for Chiluba. And they even actually amended the party constitution to allow for Chiluba to run for a third term. Luckily, that didn't get into the constitution of Zambia and back down for his third term bid. Chiluba ended up dying in 2009. But we'll get to that. So that was the first era of the MMD from 1991 to 2001. Now, 2001 comes along. FDJ has been unsuccessful, third term bid, and now MMD is looking for another person to run for presidency. So you had a few people who could have possibly become the presidents of the MMD. You had Manawasa, you had Michael Sata, and a few other people as well. Manawasa didn't actually want to become president. He had no intention, and it took Chiluba to convince him, and took a week actually to convince Manawasa to become the president of the party and to stand for presidency of the country. So this former vice president, Manawasa, then becomes a leader.
Yeah, actually, on this part, it's actually very interesting because what actually happened was that there was a rumor that started to go around that Chiluba wanted to handpick Manawasa. But even just at the point of the rumor, even before Manawasa was asked, he said no. You know, so that's how certain he was that he did not want to do this. Yeah, eventually he was convinced after a week.
So eventually he was convinced, which is quite interesting that he hadn't actually wanted to. This is also in the backdrop of a very poorly performing economy, and there was a collapse in the living standards of people. The Human Development Index had reduced quite significantly, and the people could feel it. So to maintain their tenure in office, the MMD actually resorted to suppression of the opposition. They resorted to electoral rigging, or at least some scholars do say that happened, and also constitutional changes that enabled it to rule without majority electoral support. So initially you had the 50+1, which was removed, so that they didn't have to have a majority vote for them to actually get into power. So this happens, and Manawasa wins the election, which was contested by some, the petition which was put forth, which lasted a long time in the courts. And Manawasa, as a president, very few people, if anyone, can say he wasn't a good president. He was praised for his highly skilled cabinet. He had great advisors, stable, and they set about to reform the economy. So Manawasa continues to set about policy of economic recovery. And they continue with their liberalization. And you have Anglo-American coming into the mining industry. And after a few years, they pull out of the mining industry, which was a very big blow to their economic liberalization strategy. And you have KCM getting a large stake in the mining sector. And by 2004, 2005, copper prices start rebounding. And one very interesting note is that Vendetta Resources, which actually purchased KCM at the time, after they bought the mine, they were able to receive a profit from their purchase within 3 months, which is quite interesting. So yeah, this whole mine, which could have been profitable, but it took outside investment and outside management for them to convert it into a profitable business, and they're able to do that in 3 months, which is actually, it's a bit sad.
Bruh,
Could you please repeat that? Like, I didn't really understand that point.
So Vedanta Resources, right? They purchased this mine and received like a very huge stake in the mining sector, KCM. And within 3 months of operating KCM, they had paid $25 million for KCM. Within 3 months, they had already made that $25 million and then some.
Oh, so basically your point was that we could have, if we just had the same people in place, we could have done the same.
So what I'm saying is that the mine could have been profitable, right? It was actually worth way more than they sold it for. And it's just that it was badly run and a variety of things, really. But like that outside investment could come in and turn it around so quickly, that shows how we missed the opportunity as a country. And they paid 25 million for that share. It increased that share that they paid for to $1.3 billion. Just think about that. That's crazy. That blows my mind.
bruh, for me, it's when you said they bought it for, they bought like a majority stake for 25 million.
Right? Bruh.
Not just selling mine for $25 million.
It's crazy.
Wow.
So it was undervalued at the time when.
Severely.
I wonder who undervalued it. This is a question I've just thought of in my head. So I mean, if there's anyone who's listening to us right now who has an idea who exactly was involved in the undervaluing of this mine when it was sold to Vedanta, this would be an interesting topic of conversation because they're the ones who more or less sold that mine for way less. But yeah, you can continue.
All right, so that's just a very interesting thing to note. But on the overall, the economy was revived with good economic policies and food security especially. Manawasa pursued that. I think they started the input support program, as well as the program of winter maize, which really our food security. He also pursued a lot of foreign investment as well as austerity measures, which you can say hurt the common person. The austerity measures were actually quite heavy. There was a year where there was a freeze on the wages of civil servants. So you can just imagine how unpopular a decision that could have been. And a lot of this probably or definitely contributed to the rise of populist politics that came afterwards. Another theme of Manawasa's presidency was his hard stance against corruption. The whole country was literally turned into a courtroom when you think about it. It was very heavy on corruption, to the extent that he took his predecessor, who handpicked him, to court. He took FTJ to court and stripped his immunity and all of that, that just shows the man was a very principled man and was really bound by his values.
Just on this point on Manawasa taking Chiluba to court, I feel like what's very interesting about this is that it amounted to nothing. He died and Chiluba still wasn't in jail. So, and I've noticed that this has been a pattern for years since then. We take people to court for corruption.
Even before. Because
even before.
Chiluba also took Kawanda to court. So
but I'm talking about in terms of like corruption allegations. Like people get excited and they take people to court and everything. And the thing is, obviously some of these people might be innocent, but then why is it that no one is ever found guilty, but it's clearly evident that money has been stolen from our government coffers, at the end of the day. And, this brings me back to like an episode that we did on the investigative wings. Guys, please check that out. And then you'll see some of the things we talk about and how some things are just very unacceptable in how some of these cases are investigated. And that's why they amount to nothing. So, yeah, back to you, Kabanga.
Wait, before you move on, I just wanted to also make another contribution. So there was there's another element, and I'll cite Angala Siachiwena. And so it's like, on top of Mwanawasa taking Chiluba to court, this was actually also a political tack, because at the time when Mwanawasa came into power, even though he was the president of the country, Chiluba was the president of the MMD party. And so there was a division of power, or like a struggle for power within the party. And so in Mwanawasa trying to consolidate power around himself, he used basically the court and like this taking the court as a way to decrease Chiluba's control over him. And at the same time, he went after Chiluba loyalists, which in the future hurt him because now that affected his position with like Bemba speaking voters, which Sata then later on took advantage of. So just a contribution there.
Thanks for that, Vincent and Malimba. That's crazy.
Damn, I had no idea about that.
That's absolutely crazy. So during Mwanawasa's tenure, a theme that civil society had wanted, and most Zambians, was they wanted the constitution to be amended because there were very obvious inconsistencies in the constitution and some backwards policies. But that's one area where his tenure really failed. So there was no constitutional reform during his time. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, Mwanawasa died in 2008, and that marked the end of his service for our country. Is there anything that you guys would want to add on Mwanawasa's time in service?
One thing I just want to say is that I think this is the point where we kind of start to see that when you have a voting population that of majority is content with what's going on because what's happening is starting to benefit them, you see a change where people don't really want to talk about a few things that we might think are wrong or need to be changed. From 2003, there was a Constitutional Review Commission that was implemented, and clearly there were certain things that needed to be removed out of our constitution, such as the ones targeted at Kenneth Kaunda in 1996. But those few things should have been dealt with immediately, but there were things that were not dealt with, and we didn't get a new constitution until 2016. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say, really. You can proceed, bro. Maybe Vincent has something to say.
On the one point, I just wanted to also touch on economic reform. So again, citing Angala Siachiwena, really recommend people who are interested to check out his stuff. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Development here at UCT. But just with regards to the economic policies over Mwanawasa's reign, it was the whole notion of the trickle-down effect during the period that he was president. Yeah, we did well economically and we had a lot of growth with regards to GDP. But you find that the lives of the urban poor really didn't change. And again, this is something that the SATA capitalized on, and that also contributed to the rise of populist politics. Even though our country's GDP was growing, people weren't seeing changes within like their lives. So it's like it was still low or fixed wages. People still couldn't afford as much food or certain like benefits. And yeah, and that's actually one of like the critiques of H8's current cabinet or his current economic reforms, in that they're using like a macroeconomic style similar to that of like Mwanawasa's period. So the question is whether people at the bottom are going to see the benefits.
Very good contributions. Thank you for that, Vincent and Malimba. Okay, so after Mwanawaza passes away, then Ripia Banda wins the by-elections that are held very narrowly. He wins a sympathy vote, really riding off the back of his predecessor's success. And most people had loved, or a lot of people had loved Mwanawaza, so he was able to gain that sympathy vote. Comes into power and more or less continues with Mwanawasa's economic policies, but he reverses his hard stance against corruption. He begins that first by dropping all the charges on Chiluba in the courts. So that's how that actually died. And the economy actually managed to grow by 10% during his time. And this was during a global recession, the recession of 2008, which was felt across the world and felt in many of our neighbors' economies. At the same time, you have the rise of the PF in this time. There's that rise in populist politics, where Michael Sata is appealing to the ordinary person and appealing to what the ordinary person wants. Right? So there's a lot of checks and balances at this time, because Michael Sata's voice is very loud, and he was quite good at using the media to put his message across. The Post was very instrumental at that time. And if you go back to Post headlines at the time, you see how it was very critical of the government at the time. Also during his time, you had a number of corruption allegations, including an oil deal that he was arrested for, Mr. Banda, in 2013. The MMD kind of failed to explain their plan for the people during the next election. This was in 2011. But if you remember, the country was painted blue. There was a lot of investment that went into their campaign, primarily their campaign materials, in the hope of using that to lure people, or let's just call a spade, bribe people to vote for them. At the same time, you have Michael Sata campaign, which is based on the Don't Kubeba, where he's telling people, yes, fine, you can accept that, but don't tell them who you're going to vote for. Don't tell them where you're going to vote, but accept the materials that you're receiving. And it was a very successful campaign, and the PF won the 2011 elections. So the PF was very strategic campaign, actually. So they focused their efforts on urban poor as populist tactics, where they are appealing to what people wanted, as Vincent said, more money in your pockets. And at the same time, they had a very ethnic leaning campaign message, especially the rural areas, right? In northern areas, northern provinces, and also in Western Province, where Sata had said that he would restore the Barcelona Agreement, which was a very popular thing for him to say, Western Province. So Sata comes into power, and he's not only populist campaign, but also populist in policies. So there was a very heavy rise in government spending. It was directed towards more grassroots level people. And you also had a lot of investment in infrastructure. This is where you saw all the road development start to come. So a lot of borrowing for all of this spending by the government that began. Another theme this era was that you kind of start to see the elements of Kadarism beginning. And you can attribute this to, I think, the way, or you may be able to attribute to the way the political party was was run, because it was a very grassroots level mobilization, which was quite informal. So when they came into power, those informal structures almost melded with the government as well. That's how you see that cadreism element start to pop up. In 2014, unfortunately, he also passed away during his service, and we didn't really get to see the full extent of how the policies that he pursued had affected the country.
It's also very interesting how you, or rather how you and Vincent connected the fact that these macroeconomic reforms that were in the days of Mwanawasa are what more or less drove Sata's campaign, or his campaign message rather. I think a lot of people don't really see that, because at a certain point, Sata and Mwanawasa reconciled, and Mwanawasa died, I think, after that, when Upia Banda took over. It's like that's when you actually started to see the effects of this macroeconomic approach, where the economy looks so good on paper, but the people are wondering when the money is going to reach them. You know?
Indeed.
So, yeah, I don't know what Vincent wants to add to this.
I just wanted to now highlight like maybe an additional reason as to why infrastructure projects could have been like really attractive, because not just as like it would be easy to point at, okay, no, government is working, but infrastructure projects usually are an easy way of creating employment for people, because of like the amount of labor that's required in order for you to carry out the project. So it could have been seen like as an easy way to confirm or show the people that, hey, we're doing what we said. But, within the long run, as we've now more recently seen, a lot of that was funded by debt, and like within the long term was very detrimental. Well, and just like another point is that Sata was like really smart, like politically. Hey, bro, this guy he was sharp. And
100%.
And like the play on like term called ethno-populism, where like Kabanga pointed out, it's just a fancy way of saying that he took advantage of the fact that he appealed to like Bemba speaking people. I was surprised to learn from Sishua's paper, another guy that you should check out, Zambian historian, really great, is that, do you guys know that like, okay, at the time, the Bemba vote constitutes almost like 41% of like voters, like including Copper Belt and like the northern provinces.
100%. Like, I mean, it does make sense, even just geographically, the area that's covered by that population. It does make sense. But yeah, I feel like you guys are kind of sugarcoating Sata's campaign. He ran a very tribal campaign.
No, that.
100%.
It's as simple as that. Like, he ran a very tribal campaign, and he more or less started to cause a tribal divide that was, rather political. And, I can actually attribute, like, going back to our episode, I think part 2 of anthropology during this segment, where we somewhat talked about the fact that in these areas in which the tribes used to settle back in the day, they didn't really see themselves as political factions, But as time progressed and as certain areas started to see themselves as areas of, just became this battle of power and for dominance. And that's what Sata capitalized on, because in the rural areas, this is something that we had not yet progressed from. Whereas in the metropolitan areas, you saw more of a blend and everything. But also, we see a lot of rural-urban migration constantly increasing in these metropolitan areas. And that rural-urban migration also does influence the vote. And that's why Michael Sata actually starts to also become popular in these metropolitan areas. So, anything else, guys, before we move to the next part?
I think I'm good.
Yeah, same.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so now we are going to talk about the period between late 2014 and 2021. So basically, Michael Sata had this habit of whenever he is out of the country, or whether he's out of the country or he's sick and needs treatment or anything of the like, he would leave one of the ministers in charge as acting president rather than leaving the vice president, which was the obvious thing to do. And I think that's what the constitution required. But then the constitution kind of felt conflicting, because if someone is going to act as president, you would want them to qualify to actually stand as a presidential candidate within an election. But our constitution did not allow this. So I guess that's probably the predicament Michael Sata had. I'm not too sure, but you guys can correct me if I'm. But what happens at the time when he passes away is that he then leaves the Minister of Defense, also acting Justice Minister, because Winter Kabimba was fired within that same year. Yeah, he leaves this person known as Edgar Lungu before he died, at the time when he was getting treatment. But as soon as President Sata passes away, the vice president becomes acting president. And now we have this messy battle for the PF presidency, which is pretty interesting, because then you see a lot of figures who want to take an interest in this presidency. And this led to two main factions. And these main factions both had a conference, and at the conference they did elect a presidential candidate for the 2015 election in January. So one faction, which was spearheaded by the acting president, Dr. Guy Scott, elected President Michael Sata's nephew, Mao Sampa, as the presidential candidate for the Patriotic Front. While on the other hand, the other faction voted President Edgar Lungu as the candidate for this particular election. And this was a very constant battle. And, at this time, Dr. Guy Scott actually appointed Davis Muller as the Secretary General, then the Member of Parliament for Chipili constituency, and fired Edgar Lungu, who had this Secretary General position for that. But the next day, he overturned his decision and reinstated Lungu. And then in the other faction, in the other faction that elected Lungu on 30th November in the Kawe Convention, they also felt like they were justified in their choice. So this started the battle, because these elections were held within the same week, and they had to make a decision, because two presidential candidates can't run on the same party ticket. So then this issue goes to court, and the court now rules that the faction that elected Mao's Sampa as president were wrong, and what they did was illegal, now and void, as the judge ruled. And Edgar Chagwa Lungu was then backed as presidential candidate. It's very interesting, because this faction that elected Edgar Lungu as president, they didn't really have a proper voting system. They voted via a show of hands, which is very interesting, because this is
That's crazy.
You can attribute this. You can attribute this to the informal way in which President Sata's Patriotic Front structure was.
That's funny. Like literally the class monitor.
Yeah, all in favor, and they all
Exactly.
like So yeah,
Isn't there like another dimension to it, right? Because it's like if it's by a show of hands, then you also know where each individual stands. So like those guys that may have been on the middle, like you can now determine that okay, this guy is on our side, this guy isn't. And it's like that way you kind of can paint who your enemies are and who your allies are. So that could also be another like dimension to it.
yeah, and that's the thing. Like as a party, I think you should be united to some extent in your differences, right? So yeah, that was just an interesting thing to note. But yes,
before you like move on, like just throwing it out there, right? I found that the fact that when Sacha was sick, since according to the constitution, the vice president is supposed to become acting president, but we found during those periods in time, Ngo was the one who became acting president, and like,
and sometimes and sometimes also Honorable Alexander Chikwanda was also left in charge at certain times. But yes, continue.
So I was just going to say, like, why couldn't we be comfortable with Guy Scott becoming president? And like, where do we draw the line, especially like, I guess on racial or ethnic grounds, in saying that, okay, you are a Zambian citizen, quite alright, but like, are you really Zambian? Because like, in the case of Guy Scott, the only really main thing is that he's white. And like, maybe you can argue that because his parents weren't born in Zambia, but otherwise, he was born in Zambia, and according to the constitution, he should have been acting president, but within the party, he wasn't. When like he had the right to do so or be so. So I guess it's like a wider conversation in like othering foreign nationals or people with foreign like national history, even though they are Zambian citizens, which we do still see in like the Kaunda and like the Chiluba era.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same. Like you can also say that. How is it that in the same country where Kenneth Kaunda qualified to be president for 27 years, Guy Scott does not qualify to be president, but they have the same background when it comes to nationality? Their parents are not Zambian. Yeah, that was very, very interesting. So, can I proceed?
Yes, go ahead.
Great, fantastic. So then we have Edgar Changwa Lungu, more or less seen as another underdog story, just like Chiluba. Seen as someone who was humble, always minded his business, rather quiet, very calm person. Churches said he was chosen by God, very familiar because that's what, people were saying about Chiluba. And you have President Rupia Banda endorsing Gachagua Lungu and helping him campaign, especially within the Eastern Province. A lot of people also passed down the story that he was the handpicked successor by his predecessor, President Sata. But no one really knows how true this is. And so President Edgar Lungu, he ends up winning the 2015 presidential election with, it was a very tight election, really. But, just like President Banda, Sata had already done all. So it was very hard to go against this strong grassroots support. And I'll say that the reason why this election was as close as it was also was because of the confusion that led to President Lungu being elected. Because I think that in many ways did change a lot. But yeah, it was very tight. I think, if I'm not mistaken, President Edgar Lungu got 48.84% of the vote, and President Hakainde Hichilema of the UPND got 47.16. So as you can see, this was an extremely tight election. So we started to see a lot of the economic challenges left by his predecessor start to show up, as well as a serious power shortage. And this is very interesting because the biggest problem we had is that our population had doubled, but the power in between, for example, I think maybe I can say from 2010 to 2020, you saw a double, our population double, but not have the same proportionate double increase in power generation, So, so it was just very interesting because a lot of people probably felt at the time, yes, we're going through a lot, but it's not your fault. And some things are just unfortunate, and, we're just having a lot of climate change, so I feel like that was something that was very prevalent during the campaign periods. This talk about electricity, we had load shedding for, is it 16 hours a day, if I'm not mistaken? But it was very bad, this load shedding, and very frustrating. Some of the toughest times, if you ask me, when we were going through that load shedding. I don't know if you guys could remember. I remember coming back from boarding school and it was dark the whole day, and then you only have power at night. Or the opposite.
It was crazy. It was very crazy. Was that load shedding or electricity hours?
I don't know what to call it, man. But yeah, I think it was just very crazy that we ended up going through that. But at the same time, we had an election in 2016, and President Lungu did not suggest any solution to these problems during his campaign for the 2016 election. And
sorry to butt in there. Is that the same election where he infamously said, "I have no vision"?
Yes, it is. Where he was asked if there was actually something he could promise to do for the Zambians, and he said not much. So he didn't really suggest any solution to the problems, and he used a similar strategy, such as Rupiah Bandas, of spending excessive money on campaign materials used. It was successful this time. It didn't work against him in 2016 because he had this overwhelming grassroots support, and the opposition, dare I say, was weak. This election was still very tight because opposition support was still very prevalent, for the simple fact that I think some people started to notice that the Patriotic Front did not have a plan. Rather than them actually noticing anything about the close run-up President Hichilema, they just sided with him because they didn't want to side with President Lungu. And in this election, we saw a difference of I think President Lungu got 50.35% of the vote, and President Hichilema got 47.3% of the vote. So this was very, very interesting to see. It was very tight, ended up in an election petition that eventually was thrown out, and President Edgar Lungu was sworn in for another term. But this resulted in, first of all, cadres and PF members became above the law, especially because of them felt like they played a part in this election being won, and it just turned into excessive recklessness. We saw an increase in borrowing at high interest rates. We also saw an increase in government spending further into infrastructure projects, which were done at excessively inflated prices. So, that was very sad to see. And, this also resulted in a high cost of living, double-digit inflation, a large number of people started getting arrested for criticism of, the government, and if you protested, you would be arrested. The economy just kept going worse, getting worse and worse. We ended up defaulting in our national loans. It was just a very tough time for us as a country, really. And in all of this, President Hichilema started to gain popularity, started to talk more on social media, started to ally himself as well with different opposition candidates, and especially at the time when he, just as Vincent mentioned in the previous episode, he was in prison for 100 days. And that was very significant because at that time, that's when the opposition alliance was birthed. And this was mainly to talk about that rather than, talking about, the presidential candidate that they were going to back. So then you have the 2021 period where you more or less see President Edgar Lungu being backed as the presidential candidate for the Patriotic Front. And in as much as there were other people who aspired, such as Kelvin Walefuve, they were constantly threatened, expelled from the party, and not really given a chance to actually contest for this. But then on the other side, you have these opposition leaders who do not want to back Hakainde Hichilema in the alliance, and some of them even suggesting that one of the things that they don't want to support is that the name of the alliance changes to UPND Alliance, just so that they don't have issues with registration issues of the alliance, which they thought might be used to undermine their campaigns and not allow them to contest in the election. So, President Lungu ends up going unopposed in the party conference, and he is elected the leader of this campaign and the preferred presidential candidate. Some people argued that it wasn't a legal thing, and it ended up going to court, and the court did rule that he is allowed to contest within this election. And it was a very interesting election, increased government spending. He did choose a woman as his running mate for this candidate, which we also saw happen in the previous campaign as well. And I think that was significant. And we saw, that this was, it started a pattern, because then we had the UPND who in 2016 went with a man as their running in Godfrey Mwamba, and in the 2021 election went with Mutale Nalumango as their running mate. So then, in the 2021 campaign, President Edgar Lungu goes with Professor Nkandulo, who for some reason became infamous because, first of all, of allegedly being very tribal and causing issues within the Bemba royal establishment, and as well as the Bisa clan, or rather kingdom. And you also have this discontentment from the university students who are not really happy with how they were being treated when she was Minister of Higher Education, and most of them felt like she did lack empathy at this time. So that, on top of all the issues that were going on within our country, it did cause very huge discontentments. So then we have our 2021 election, and from the beginning of the election, it's very clear who is going to win, and it's just a matter of when than if. From the first batch of results that are announced, President Hakainde Hichilema is in the lead. And this was a 70.6% voter turnout, which was, if you ask me, rather quite high, because 5 years before that it was 56.45, and the year before that it was 32.36. I mean, that was a by-election, so I don't count it, but from 56% to 70% is a huge huge difference, and that just shows how many people wanted their say in this election. And President Hichilema ends up winning this election by 59.02%, and President Edgar Lungu loses this election by 38.71%. And on the 24th of August 2021, President Hichilema is sworn in as president. And then this ushers in the UPNT, or rather, as people call it, the New Dawn administration. So before I get into, before I get into the next part, does anyone want to make a contribution?
For me, I just find it quite interesting, like the role that media has played over time in our elections. Just like starting from Michael Sata's first win in the election. At that time, he mostly used like traditional media, which was mainly the Post. Actually, the Post newspapers really campaigned very heavily for PF, you can say that. And that was for that first election. And in the second election, you had now the use of alternative media in music, especially, where you had that first song, that first hit, Don't Kubeba, which was a very popular song. And then you also have in Edgar Lungu's win, I think I'm not sure whether it was the first or second, where you had also the use of alternative media in the song Dunana Race, a banger of a song. Yeah, shame it really was a prophecy for the country as well. And then you have HH in the previous election, social media. So it's just that evolution in the use of politics, which I find quite interesting. And I just wanted to mention that.
What about you, Vincent? What do you have to say?
I just wanted to add with regards to the voting or the number of votes. So it's interesting that when you look at the presidential level, there was a clear landslide victory. But then when you look at, I guess, your number of seats in parliament, which I guess you can call it your middle tier, you still find that the PF party was able to gain considerable seats within parliament. So one could argue that the country was no to Lungu, but they are still in support of certain PF candidates. So it would be interesting to see going forward whether the PF will be the first party in history to actually rebound, or they'll follow the similar trend of other political parties and just become shadows of their former selves.
Yeah, and also I think the one thing that might be a challenge for them is, first of all, what's their way forward? What's their message to the people now? Because if you had a heavily funded political campaign in 2021 and now you don't have the resource for that, what are you going to use to speak to the people? That's the first thing. Secondly, they can't really agree on a presidential, they can't agree on a party president at the moment. And you have almost half of if not more than half of the executive committee within the PF who actually do want to be part of this, who want to vie for this party presidency, and trying to drum up support for that. So they have a lot that they need to figure out, and we'll see what happens. And we might see another party pop up as well. I think that would be interesting to see. A lot of people are talking about the Socialist Party, but we haven't really seen enough of them to see what could possibly. I mean, generally now we are in a situation where, the UPND definitely won because people felt overlooked and taken advantage of the government, and they felt like the government had a huge disappointment. But also, President Hichilema did gain some popularity by communicating his plan a bit more. People used to feel like his plan was a lot more unrealistic and, anchored by a lot of rumors as well. So they didn't really have hope for that and everything. So, they did offer a lot more of a plan, an economic recovery plan. And, they worked with more or less outcasts from the PF government during the election to drum up support. They gained a lot of popularity in the metropolitan areas of Lusaka and the Copper Belt, and as well as Livingston. So you have like them becoming more or less this, like Kabanga said, like to gain popularity and increase that on their front. So yeah, and yeah, as they have come in, our exchange rate has started to do much better than it was before. You have more of a decentralized disbursement of funds in constituency development funds. You saw the introduction of free education and everything, but it'll just be interesting to see whether this was a means to an end, just like the populist rhetoric that Sata used, or they actually do have a heart for the people. And like, as Vincent said, just to see whether this macroeconomic strategy might actually trickle down to the less privileged, so yeah. And yeah, but a lot of things still haven't changed about the fact that, just like in Manawasa's time, when people are happy, they don't complain about anything that's gone wrong. We still need our classrooms to be less populated. In as much as we have education, we need new desks. The cost of living is still high, despite the fact that we have single-digit inflation. The fact is that we still have inflation, so prices are still going up at the end of the day. And maybe our incomes should be proportionate to the price increases, or they should be able to allow us to afford these price increases, at the end of the day. So yeah, but generally this has been barred by the fact that we have like so many so many speeches that are given to us showing the UPND's plan, and from those speeches people get inspired, but the taste of the pudding is in the eating, and people are not waiting until they eat the pudding. They are seeing they are hearing about the pudding first before they even see it. Not even before they taste it, but before they even see it. So yeah, so basically, yeah, that's that. And we have finally caught you guys up to where we are at now. Guys, do you have any contributions before we end this particular conversation?
I was going to say people should just check out Sishua's article on HH's first 100 days in office. He's got some interesting critiques, and he sheds a bit more light on certain issues on how HH has handled things so far. So I don't know if we can include it in the link for the podcast or something. But yeah, he's a good guy to follow. He may be overly harsh, but within good measure.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Let me just final that is just how I think right now. It's very important for civil society and just for ordinary citizens to be having these conversations, especially that we don't really have strong opposition to offer checks and balance. So there's nothing wrong with critiquing government. Actually, should be encouraged. I draw back to what Manawasa had said when he took Michael Sata for treatment in South Africa, and these guys were very, very heavy opponents. He said, to be president, I do not want to be hero worshipped all the time. I want people who can correct me, show me that the best it is done this way. Of course, if I do not agree, I will tell them that I do not agree for this and reason. So basically just encouraging more of these conversations and more of an analytical eye on what the government actually says they do and what they actually mean. So those are my final thoughts on it.
Thank you so much, guys. And I couldn't have said it any better. And we appreciate you guys taking the time. You know that we've spoken a lot. Barely have a voice now because of all the talking we've had to do, but I think it was all necessary. We just want to appreciate all of you for tuning in. We are the Village ZM, and we'll catch you next week. Zambian History Month, and I'm absolutely excited for that. So until the next episode, it's over and out from us. Bye for now, guys.